After her husband's death, she decided to clean out the attic to let go of the past. But in an old suitcase covered in dust, she found evidence of his double life. Now she has to figure out who he really was. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The rain had not stopped since morning. It fell in a steady, whispering rhythm that soaked through the November air and blurred the outlines of the cemetery beyond the line of bare trees. Myrna West stood beside the open grave, her black coat heavy with moisture, her gloved fingers clenched tightly around the small, trembling hand of her daughter. The priest's voice rose and fell in gentle waves, the sound muffled by the wind that carried the scent of wet earth and flowers beginning to wilt. People had gathered around, their faces solemn, their umbrellas bending slightly under the cold gusts. Myrna barely saw them. Her eyes were fixed on the dark shape of the coffin as it descended, on the ropes sliding slowly through the hands of the men from the funeral home, on the final moment when the lid disappeared beneath the rim of the earth. When the first shovel of soil struck the wood, a hollow thud echoed in her chest. She flinched, but did not move. Her husband, John, was gone. The man who had fixed the car every Saturday morning, who whistled off-key while frying eggs, who used to fall asleep in the armchair with a book open on his chest. He had become a part of the ground. Their daughter, Amy, only 13, stared silently, confusion and grief mingling on her young face. She did not cry. Not yet. Myrna had told her that it was all right to cry, but the girl had simply nodded and slipped her hand back into her mother's. When the service ended, people came to them one by one, saying all the words that are supposed to comfort. He was a good man. He's in a better place. Time heals everything. Myrna smiled faintly, said thank you, and felt each phrase pass through her like air. Back home, the kitchen filled with neighbors and church friends bringing food. Casseroles, pies, dishes wrapped in foil, all arranged neatly on the counter. The smell of baked cheese and cinnamon should have been comforting, but it made her stomach turn. She nodded as people spoke, listening without hearing, her mind drifting to the hollow space upstairs, where John's tools hung neatly on the wall, untouched since the day he died. After everyone left, she stood alone in the doorway, listening to the house breathe. The refrigerator hummed, the pipes sighed, and the clock on the wall ticked too loudly. Everything remained exactly as it had been before, and yet nothing was the same. In the first days after the funeral, she tried to keep to routine. Amy still had to go to school. Homework still needed to be done. The laundry didn't stop piling up. The rhythm of necessity kept her moving, though her body felt heavy, as if grief had weighted her down. She rose early, packed lunches, and watched the bus carry her daughter away. When she returned to the quiet house, silence pressed against her like water. John's mug still sat on the kitchen shelf, the faint chip along the rim catching the light. His jacket hung by the door, smelling faintly of oil and pine soap. She couldn't bring herself to wash it. At night, the loneliness became unbearable. Myrna would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, convinced she could hear his footsteps in the hallway, or the sound of his keys on the dresser. Sometimes, she caught herself listening for the sound of his old pickup pulling into the driveway. The ache of habit was cruel. It filled the emptiness with ghosts of what had been ordinary. Amy would wake from dreams and come quietly into her room, curling up beside her without a word. They would lie there together, both pretending to sleep, both pretending not to be afraid of what the morning would bring. Weeks passed. The house began to feel like a museum to a life interrupted. Every object seemed sacred and wrong at the same time. Myrna spent hours sitting at the kitchen table, the unpaid bills spread before her, unable to focus on the numbers. She told herself that she had known John completely. They had been married for 16 years, shared everything, or so she believed. But as she sorted through his papers, preparing to meet with the lawyer, she began to notice gaps. There were tax returns, insurance forms, bank statements, but no trace of anything that predated their marriage. No birth certificate, no photographs from childhood, no letters, no old friends who ever called. She tried to recall if she had ever met anyone from his past. He had once mentioned growing up in a small northern town, but he never said its name. When she had asked, he smiled, brushed her hair back from her face, and told her that some things were better left where they belonged. At the time, she had laughed and let it go. He was a private man, and she thought that privacy was a kind of humility. Now, alone in the house they had built together, she began to wonder if she had mistaken silence for peace. One Saturday, after Amy went to stay with a friend, Myrna decided to clean the attic. It was something John had always meant to do but never had. The thought of it gave her purpose, and perhaps she needed to feel close to him again, even if only through the dust and forgotten things he'd left behind. She pulled down the folding ladder and climbed up, each step creaking beneath her weight. The smell of wood and old insulation filled the air. Dust motes swirled in the narrow beam of light from the single round window. The attic was cluttered with boxes, holiday decorations, old clothes, a rocking horse from Amy's toddler years, stacks of books they'd meant to donate. Myrna knelt and opened a few, sorting what to keep and what to throw away. After an hour, her hands were covered in dust, and her back ached. She was about to stop when something caught her eye, a dark shape half hidden behind a rolled-up rug. She pulled it out and felt its weight immediately. It was an old leather briefcase, worn at the edges, the handle smooth from use. The initials embossed on the top read J.R. The letters were faint, but they were not his. John West had no middle initial, and certainly not an R. For a long time she simply stared at it. The air seemed to grow still, as though the attic itself was waiting. She brushed away the layer of dust with trembling fingers and felt the leather crackle beneath her touch. The latches resisted at first, stiff with age, but with a firm press they gave way. The lid lifted with a slow creak, releasing a breath of stale air that smelled of paper and time. Inside were several envelopes tied with a ribbon, a stack of photographs, a folded birth certificate, and a newspaper clipping, browned with age. Everything was arranged neatly, almost lovingly, as if whoever packed it wanted it to be found exactly like this. Myrna hesitated before touching anything. Her pulse quickened, a strange dread curling in her stomach. She picked up the top photograph. It showed a man and a woman standing in front of a modest white house, their arms around a small boy with dark hair. The man's smile was familiar, his posture unmistakable. It was John, but younger, leaner, his hair thicker, his eyes brighter. The woman beside him was not her. On the back of the photo, written in a delicate looping hand, were the words, "We'll wait for you. Come back when it's over." Her hand shook as she turned to the next item, a birth certificate. The name of the father was John R. Rose. The initials on the briefcase. The date was from nearly 20 years before she met him. The mother's name was unreadable under the smudge of old ink. The child's name, Michael. Myrna sank to her knees, clutching the document. Her breath came shallowly, the air thick with disbelief. She thought of John laughing in the kitchen, teaching Amy how to ride a bike, singing quietly when he thought no one was listening. She tried to imagine him as someone else, a man with another name, another life, another family. The thought refused to settle, sliding off her mind like oil. She opened one of the envelopes. Inside was a short letter in the same handwriting as the photo inscription. "John, they're asking questions again. I told them you were away on work, but I can't keep lying. Michael misses you. I miss you. Please come back before it's too late." The signature was only an L. Myrna folded the paper slowly, her hands trembling. A drop of rain struck the attic window, startling her. Outside, the storm had returned. She closed the briefcase, but couldn't bring herself to fasten the latches. Her mind spun in circles. Was this an affair? A family he had abandoned? Or something worse? She thought of the way he sometimes woke at night, sweating, whispering names she didn't recognize, how he avoided photographs, how he once said that he didn't like looking back. For the rest of the evening, she sat in the attic with the open briefcase beside her, staring at the rain sliding down the small window pane. The sound was hypnotic, steady, like a heartbeat. Somewhere beneath the confusion and the fear, a faint voice whispered that the man she had buried was not entirely the man she had loved. But the voice was small, and she wasn't ready to listen. When she finally came down, it was past midnight. The house was dark, except for the dim kitchen light she had left on. She set the briefcase on the table and sat opposite it, her reflection faintly visible on its leather surface. It looked harmless now, an ordinary object, yet it seemed to fill the room with its presence. She told herself she would wait until morning, that she would think clearly then. But even as she said it, she knew sleep would not come. The rain continued through the night, soft and relentless, drumming against the roof. Upstairs, Amy dreamed peacefully, untouched by the tremors shifting the foundation of her mother's world. Myrna remained at the table, staring at the briefcase, feeling the walls close in. The house was the same as it had been yesterday. Same walls, same photographs, same air. But she knew that something had changed forever. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a thin mist that clung to the windows. Myrna was still awake, her eyes dry and burning. She rose slowly, gathered the papers, and placed them carefully back into the briefcase. As she locked it, she whispered his name under her breath, as if saying it aloud might summon an answer. Nothing came. Only silence, patient and deep. She carried the case to her bedroom closet and pushed it behind a row of shoes. When Amy came downstairs, sleepy and unaware, Myrna smiled and poured her a bowl of cereal, her voice calm, her movements measured. But inside her chest, something fragile had cracked open. She could feel it with every breath, the sense that her life, her marriage, her memories, all contained a hollow she had never seen before. That night, after Amy was asleep, she sat again at the kitchen table, the briefcase now hidden upstairs, but its weight still pressing on her mind. She thought of the woman in the photograph, of the boy between them, of the name that was not her husband's. She told herself it could all be explained, that there was some simple, innocent story behind it all. But when she closed her eyes, she saw only the rain on the attic window and the face of the man she thought she knew, smiling back at her from another life. The next day she would decide. She would either lock the truth away forever or start to look for it. For now, the house remained still, filled with the ghosts of what she could no longer ignore. The rain had stopped, but the silence that replaced it felt heavier, waiting, as though the house itself knew that this was only the beginning. The morning after the discovery was unnervingly bright, the kind of false cheerfulness that made Myrna feel as though the world were mocking her. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, catching dust motes that hung motionless in the air. She had slept no more than an hour, if at all. When she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror, she barely recognized herself. Her face looked pale, almost translucent, her eyes rimmed in red. Amy sat at the breakfast table, swinging her legs beneath the chair, asking if they could visit the library that afternoon. Myrna smiled automatically, nodding, but her thoughts were already upstairs with the briefcase hidden behind her shoes. Every sound in the house seemed sharper than usual, the hum of the refrigerator, the clink of the spoon against Amy's bowl, the slow ticking of the clock. It felt as if time itself had shifted slightly out of rhythm. At work, she could not concentrate. The library was quiet, as it always was on a weekday morning, with only a few elderly patrons browsing the shelves. Myrna sat behind the circulation desk, the smell of old paper and binding glue surrounding her. Normally that scent comforted her, but today it brought only unease. She tried to read the labels on returned books, but found herself glancing repeatedly at the small clock on the wall. Each minute dragged her deeper into thought. John's other name echoed through her mind, John R. Rose. She wrote it on a scrap of paper, then immediately tore it up. The act made her feel both guilty and desperate. At lunch, instead of eating, she opened the computer in the staff office and typed the name into a newspaper archive database. It was a futile impulse. She half expected nothing to come up. But when the search results appeared, her breath caught. There were several articles, all more than 20 years old. The headlines blurred before her eyes until one stopped her cold. Tragic house fire claims. Woman's life. Husband missing. Child presumed dead. The name beneath the headline, Jonathan Rose. She opened the article, her heart hammering so hard that she feared someone nearby might hear it. The grainy black and white photograph showed a modest 2-story home reduced to charred beams and ash. Standing among the smoke in the background was a man whose features were hauntingly familiar. The angle of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, even the way his hands were half raised as though mid-motion. The text beneath the image was brief. A fire had broken out late at night in the Rose residence. The wife, Lillian Rose, was found dead at the scene. Their son, Michael, was initially believed to have perished, but search teams later discovered evidence that he might have escaped. The husband had disappeared before the fire was fully contained and was wanted for questioning. Myrna leaned back, unable to breathe. Her hands trembled so violently that she accidentally clicked the mouse, closing the page. She sat frozen, staring at the empty desktop screen. Her husband, the gentle, patient man who built birdhouses for Amy and volunteered at church, was a missing person, possibly a suspect in his first wife's death. She tried to rationalize it, to find any other explanation. Perhaps there had been another man with the same name. Perhaps it was coincidence. But she knew better. The initials on the briefcase, the photograph of the boy, the letter from Lillian, they fit together with grim precision. That evening, she could not bear to sit in the same house where his things still surrounded her. She left Amy with a neighbor, claiming she needed to clear her head, and drove aimlessly through the outskirts of town until the sun dipped below the horizon. The road unfurled ahead like a ribbon of dusk, and the headlights carved tunnels of light through the gathering dark. Somewhere along the drive, a thought formed with such clarity that she almost said it aloud. She had to know the truth. The need was not curiosity. It was survival. Her memories of John had begun to warp under the weight of doubt. If she didn't uncover what had really happened, every smile he had ever given her would start to feel like a lie. The next morning she requested a week off work, citing exhaustion and grief. Her supervisor, a kind woman who had lost her husband years ago, nodded in sympathy. "Take all the time you need," she said. Myrna thanked her, but said nothing more. That night, when Amy fell asleep, she packed a small bag, printed the old articles, and wrote a note to her daughter, saying she would be gone a few days to settle some paperwork. Then she drove north. The town where the fire had occurred lay 3 hours away, surrounded by farmland and the faint smell of smoke from distant wood stoves. As she drove past faded billboards and peeling barns, Myrna felt as though she were slipping backward in time. The main street was little more than a row of closed shops, a diner, a post office, a small hardware store with dust-covered windows. She parked near a historical society sign that looked almost forgotten itself and stepped inside. The room smelled of mildew and old paper. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman with silver hair gathered in a loose bun. She smiled vaguely when Myrna approached. "I'm researching a family that used to live here," Myrna began, her voice trembling slightly. "The Rose family. There was a fire many years ago." The woman's smile faded into a look of recognition. "The Roses," she said softly. "Yes, I remember. That was a terrible night. Whole town talked about it for years." "Do you remember them?" Myrna asked. The woman nodded. "Lillian was sweet. Quiet, though. Her husband John, I think. He was different. Not unfriendly, just closed. Kept to himself. After the fire, people said all kinds of things. Some thought he'd run away because he was guilty. Others thought he'd been trying to save the boy and just couldn't face what happened. But the truth? No one really knew." Myrna swallowed. "What about the child?" The woman sighed. "The little boy. Michael. They never found him. Some said he died in the woods trying to get away. Others believed someone took him in. There were rumors, of course. People claimed to have seen him later, but nothing ever proven." She rummaged behind the counter and handed Myrna a photocopy of an old newspaper clipping. The same article Myrna had already read, but this one carried an additional paragraph handwritten at the bottom. Local officials confirmed later that traces of small footprints were found near the creek, suggesting the boy may have survived. Myrna thanked the woman and left, her legs unsteady. The air outside felt heavier now, pressing down on her shoulders. She drove out toward the address mentioned in the article. The road narrowed into a dirt lane flanked by dead cornstalks. The remains of the house still stood, though barely a blackened skeleton of beams and crumbling stone. The front steps led nowhere, the porch half collapsed. Weeds had claimed the yard, and shards of glass glittered faintly in the soil. Myrna stepped carefully among them, her shoes crunching on the gravel. She stood before what had once been the front door and tried to imagine the lives that had unfolded here. Lillian, writing letters late at night, waiting for a husband who might never return. A child asleep upstairs. A sudden blaze, flames consuming everything. The air smelled faintly of ash even after all these years. Myrna's throat tightened. She wondered what John had felt in those last moments. Terror, guilt, despair. Did he run because he was guilty, or because he had lost everything? She wanted to hate him for his silence, but her heart ached instead. A noise startled her, a voice behind her, thin and raspy. She turned to see an old man standing near the fence, holding a small bag of feed for the chickens that pecked lazily at his feet. "You shouldn't be wandering here," he said. "It's not safe. Floorboards'll give way." "I'm sorry," she replied quickly. "I just wanted to see it." He squinted at her. "You're not a reporter, are you?" "No, just someone who knew them a long time ago." He nodded slowly. "Well, not much left to see. But I remember that night. Could see the smoke from my porch. Folks said the husband lit the fire himself, but I never believed it. He loved that boy. I saw him carrying the kid out once when the place was smaller. You could see it. Man would have walked through hell for him. Maybe he did." Myrna felt tears sting her eyes. "What happened after?" "After the fire? Police searched for weeks. Then they said he must have run. A year later, someone found a toy car down by the creek. Said it belonged to the boy. Never proved anything." The man shifted his weight and stared at her more closely. "You remind me of her, you know. The wife. Same kind of eyes." Myrna thanked him, barely able to speak, and walked back to her car. She sat behind the wheel for a long time, the engine off, the silence immense. Through the windshield she could see the house sagging in the afternoon light, its windows like empty eyes. Everything she had learned fit together like pieces of a story she wished she'd never read. The briefcase, the initials, the letters, they were fragments of a life that John had buried. He had run not because he was evil, but because he was broken. That night, she checked into a small roadside motel, its neon sign flickering weakly. The bed smelled faintly of detergent, and the heater rattled when she turned it on. She spread the old articles across the bedspread, reading them again and again. The narrative changed each time she read it. Sometimes he was a victim, sometimes a fugitive, sometimes both. When she closed her eyes, she saw the photograph of the boy, Michael, caught mid-laughter with a missing tooth and wide, trusting eyes. She imagined John carrying him through smoke, shouting his name into the fire, then vanishing when the world believed him dead. As dawn crept through the blinds, Myrna sat at the small table by the window, her notebook open. She began writing down every detail she had found, the dates, the names, the inconsistencies. The librarian's words returned to her. No one really knew. That was no longer good enough. She needed to know. She could not rest until she found out what became of the boy and what kind of man her husband truly was. When she finally drove back home, the landscape outside the window blurred with motion. Every field, every lonely farmhouse seemed to whisper pieces of a story she was still trying to assemble. The weight in her chest had changed. It was no longer just grief, it was purpose. She now understood that John had lived with ghosts, not secrets of betrayal, but of guilt and sorrow. He had built a new life on top of old ashes, hoping the past would never rise again. But it had, through her hands, through the opening of a dusty briefcase on a cold, rainy night. By the time she reached her own street, evening had settled. The porch light glowed softly, and through the living room window, she could see Amy reading on the couch. Myrna turned off the car and sat for a moment, watching her daughter's face illuminated by the lamp. The thought came unbidden. Should Amy ever know? Should she grow up believing her father had been the man she adored, or the stranger Myrna was only beginning to understand? The question gnawed at her as she stepped inside, kissed her daughter's head, and forced a smile. That night, when Amy was asleep, she took the briefcase from the closet once more. The smell of leather and paper filled the room. She spread the contents out carefully on the table, the letters, the certificates, the photographs, and stared at them until the edges blurred. There was fear in the truth she had uncovered, but there was compassion too. For the first time since his death, she felt not betrayed, but profoundly sad for him. He had carried all of this alone, through years of quiet mornings and shared laughter, through birthdays and small domestic joys. The life he gave them had been real, even if the name he lived under was not. As the clock struck midnight, she whispered his name, both of them this time, and felt the faintest sense of forgiveness flicker in her chest. The shadows of his past had reached her, but so had the light of his love. And though she still had no answers about what exactly had happened that night long ago, she knew one thing with certainty. She would keep searching. Not to destroy him, but to understand him. To find the truth that could make peace with both the man he once was and the one she had loved. Outside, the wind stirred through the trees, carrying with it the smell of rain. Myrna sat alone in the circle of lamplight, the papers scattered like a map of forgotten lives, and for the first time she felt that the past was no longer just something to fear. It was a path she had to walk, one step at a time, toward whatever waited at its end. The road home felt longer than when she had driven away. The landscape that had once seemed dull and familiar now carried a strange, melancholy weight, as if the fields themselves were whispering stories she was only beginning to understand. When Myrna turned down her street, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and rain. The porch light she had left on glowed weakly through the fog. Inside, the house looked unchanged. Amy's backpack by the stairs, the stack of unread mail on the counter, the faint hum of the refrigerator. But to Myrna, everything had shifted. The walls, the furniture, even the air seemed charged with the knowledge she carried back. She closed the door quietly behind her, stood in the dim hallway, and listened. The house had never felt more alive with silence. Amy called from the living room, her voice light and hopeful, as if nothing had happened during her mother's absence. Myrna went to her, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They ate dinner together, simple soup and bread, and Amy talked about school projects, a new book she was reading, and how the neighbor's cat had kittens. Myrna nodded, responded when she could, but her thoughts drifted again and again to the burned house, the photograph of the little boy, the stories told by the people who had known him. Every word her daughter spoke seemed layered over the ghost of another child, one lost to time, but somehow still haunting her life through the man they both had loved. Later, after Amy had gone to bed, Myrna sat alone at the kitchen table, the briefcase once again before her. She had unpacked it earlier and laid everything out in careful order. The letters, the photographs, the documents she'd collected from the archives. Each piece was both a revelation and a wound. She traced her finger along the faded edges of the photograph of John and the boy Michael, and thought about what it must have cost him to leave that life behind. Perhaps it had destroyed something inside him. Perhaps the gentle patience she had always admired in him was not serenity at all, but exhaustion from years of hiding. When she finally rose from the table, she felt older than her years. Upstairs, the hallway was dim, the night light from Amy's room casting a soft glow across the floor. Myrna paused in the doorway, watching her daughter sleep. The girl's face was peaceful, her breathing slow and steady, her arm curled beneath her cheek. Myrna's throat tightened. She wanted to reach out, to promise that nothing would ever change, that her father had been the man she believed him to be. But she couldn't. The truth had made such promises impossible. Yet at the same time, she knew that the truth could destroy what little sense of safety her daughter still had. The thought of Amy learning that her father had lived under another name, had once been accused of something so terrible, filled Myrna with dread. Some truths, she realized, were not meant to be spoken aloud. In the following days, life settled into a rhythm again, but it was an uneasy one. Myrna went back to work, shelved books, greeted patrons, and smiled when spoken to. Amy returned to school, her laughter sometimes echoing faintly through the house when she practiced lines for a school play. Outwardly, things seemed almost normal, but inside, Myrna felt as though she were living on a fault line, waiting for the next tremor. Every time she passed the closet where the briefcase rested, she felt its presence like a living thing. She began to imagine it breathing behind the door, whispering in the dark. One evening, she sat at her desk with a blank sheet of paper before her and began to write. It was not meant to be sent. It was something between a letter and a confession. "John," she wrote at the top, then paused. The name looked foreign now, incomplete without the other, the one she had found in the records, the one that belonged to a different life. She began again. "John, or maybe I should say, Jonathan Rose. I don't know which name you lived by in the end, or which one belonged to the man I married. I only know that both of them are gone now, and what remains is a silence I can barely carry." The words flowed slowly at first, then faster, as though something deep within her had been waiting for release. She wrote about the attic, the briefcase, the discovery, the trip to the burned house, She wrote about the boy named Michael, about the people who had whispered rumors and pity, about the ache of realizing that her husband had lived with a past too heavy to share. By the time she set the pen down, tears had blurred the ink. The letter ended with a single sentence. "You should have told me, but I think I understand why you didn't." She folded the page, slipped it into an envelope, and placed it in the drawer beside her bed. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of something close to it. The next morning was quiet and gray. Myrna made breakfast, packed Amy's lunch, and walked her to the bus stop. The cold air stung her cheeks, and when the bus pulled away, she stood for a long time watching the road until it disappeared behind the curve. When she returned home, the house felt too still, as if waiting for her to act. She climbed the attic stairs, the wood creaking beneath her feet. The air smelled of dust and insulation, and light filtered weakly through the small window. The briefcase sat on the floor where she had last placed it. She knelt beside it, resting her hands on its worn surface. It felt neither menacing nor inviting now, just heavy, patient, inevitable. "I know," she whispered into the stillness. "I know you were trying to protect us, and maybe yourself. Maybe both." Her voice trembled, and the words hung in the air like a confession to no one. She opened the briefcase one last time, glanced at its contents, and then began to put everything back. The letters first, then the photographs, then the documents she had gathered. She lingered for a moment over the photograph of John and the boy. The image no longer felt like a betrayal, but a reminder of something human, something wounded. She placed it gently on top of the others, closed the lid, and snapped the clasps shut. The metallic clicks echoed through the attic like punctuation marks at the end of a long, unfinished story. She carried the briefcase to the far corner, where she had found it, and set it down. Then she covered it with an old quilt, tucking the fabric carefully around the edges. For a long moment she stayed there, kneeling in the dust, her hand resting on the covered shape. "You've done enough harm," she said softly, "and enough good. It's time to rest now." Then she stood, brushed the dust from her skirt, and turned off the light. Downstairs, she opened the windows. Fresh air filled the house, cool and clean. She spent the afternoon cleaning, scrubbing the counters, dusting the shelves, moving through the rooms as if to reclaim them. By evening, sunlight poured across the floorboards, and the air smelled faintly of lemons and soap. Amy returned from school in a rush of chatter and laughter, dropping her backpack on the floor and hugging her mother tightly. Myrna hugged her back, feeling warmth rise in her chest. It struck her then that perhaps this was what John had wanted all along, to give them something untouched by the past, even if it meant building it on fragile ground. Spring arrived slowly, quietly. The snow melted into the earth, leaving behind soft mud and the promise of green. One Saturday morning, Myrna and Amy went to the nursery outside town and bought 3 young apple trees. John had once talked about planting a small orchard behind the house, though he had never found the time. They dug the holes together, their hands dirty, the sun gentle on their backs. Amy laughed when the first tree tilted slightly to one side, and Myrna laughed with her, the sound startling in its unfamiliar joy. When the last tree was in the ground, they stood back to look at their work. The thin branches reached upward like fragile arms, and Myrna felt a sudden, quiet peace settle over her. Inside, on the mantel above the fireplace, she placed a new photograph, one she had taken that morning of Amy standing beside the newly planted trees, her smile bright, her eyes full of life. Next to it stood the old photograph of John and Amy together, taken years before at the lake, his arm around their daughter, his face softened by sunlight. Myrna looked at them side by side, past and present sharing the same small space. and for the first time it didn't hurt. That night, after Amy went to bed, Myrna sat by the fireplace with a cup of tea. The room was dim except for the flicker of the flames. She thought of the letter she had written, and of the briefcase, now hidden again, under dust and cloth. She would never tell Amy about what she had found. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Some truths, she had learned, belonged to the dead. Her daughter deserved to remember her father as he had been to her. A man who made pancakes on Sunday mornings, who taught her how to fish, who carried her on his shoulders at the fair. That was the legacy worth keeping. The rest could fade into the quiet, where it had waited all along. When the fire burned low, she rose, turned off the lights, and walked to Amy's room. The girl was fast asleep, one hand curled beneath her cheek, the other resting on the blanket. Myrna leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Good night, sweetheart," she whispered. "Everything's going to be all right." In her own room, the window was opened slightly, and the cool spring air stirred the curtains. Myrna lay down, listening to the wind rustle through the branches of the new trees outside. The sound was soft, like breathing. For the first time in months, she felt no dread when she closed her eyes. The past was still there, somewhere above her head in the attic, sealed in its leather tomb, but it no longer held power over her. It had become part of the house's quiet, part of the rhythm of life that moved forward no matter how heavy the memories. In the weeks that followed, Myrna often found herself standing by the window at dusk, watching the apple trees sway. Their leaves had begun to open, small and bright against the fading light. She would think then of John, not the man she had uncovered in old papers, but the one who had lived beside her, whose laughter still lingered in the walls, whose absence had taught her the shape of love in all its complexity. She no longer needed to forgive him. Forgiveness had turned into something gentler, a kind of acceptance that made room for both his truth and hers. On a warm evening in late May, she took the photograph of the orchard from the mantel and placed it in a new frame. Beneath it, on a small brass plate, she engraved the words herself. Not everything hidden must be found. Sometimes silence is another way to love. She set it back in its place and smiled. When she finally turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to bed, the house was dark except for the faint glow from Amy's nightlight. The floor creaked softly beneath her steps, familiar and comforting. Outside, a breeze moved through the branches, carrying the faint scent of blossoms. Myrna paused in the doorway of her bedroom and looked back once, toward the ceiling above where the attic lay. She imagined the briefcase resting quietly beneath its cover, undisturbed. She whispered good night, not to the past, not even to John, but to everything that had finally settled into peace. Then she lay down, closed her eyes, and let the silence embrace her, gentle and full, like the end of a long, unfinished song, finally allowed to fade into stillness. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Watch the next video for another powerful story, and don't forget to share this one with someone who loves true, emotional tales.